She had one day left before the temperature dropped beyond recovery, not the kind of cold that feels uncomfortable, but the kind that locks everything in place and removes your ability to fix mistakes. On the frontier, that line is real. Before it, you prepare. After it, you survive whatever you manage to prepare. There is no adjustment once the cold settles in. It does not give time, and it does not forgive delay. She understood that better than most because she had already seen what winter could do when someone underestimated it. Cabins that looked strong in autumn became traps in deep winter. Tools froze. Food spoiled in ways people did not expect. And firewood, the one thing everyone depended on, became useless if it was not stored correctly. That was the problem she was facing now, and she knew she did not have enough time to solve it the usual way. Her cabin stood alone, built from rough-cut logs, positioned where the wind did not hit directly but still exposed enough to receive light during the day. It was not poorly built. In fact, it followed most of the rules that experienced settlers used. The structure was stable, the roof angled correctly, and the main heat source placed where it could distribute warmth across the space. But the problem was never the cabin itself. The problem was always what happened inside it during winter. Heat is not something you create once and keep. It is something you constantly fight to maintain, and that fight depends entirely on fuel. Without enough firewood, even the best-built cabin becomes a cold box that slowly drains heat faster than you can replace it. She stepped outside early, before the sun had fully risen, and the first thing she noticed was the ground. It had changed overnight, not frozen solid yet, but close enough that each step sounded different. The softness was gone. In its place was resistance. That kind of change only happens right before a temperature drop. It was a warning, and she did not ignore it. She moved toward the woodpile without wasting time, scanning it with a level of attention that went beyond counting pieces. She was calculating duration, how long it would last under constant use, how quickly it would burn in extreme cold, how much she would need each day if the temperature dropped the way she expected it to. The answer was not good. What she had was enough for a normal winter pattern, but not enough for what was coming. Most people in that situation would try to gather more wood. That is the instinct. But instinct does not always match reality. Gathering enough wood in a single day to survive an entire winter is not possible, especially when the wood needs to be cut, dried, and stored properly. Fresh wood burns poorly. Wet wood creates smoke and low heat. And even if she managed to collect more, there was another problem that most people overlook: storage. Firewood cannot simply be stacked anywhere. If it absorbs moisture, it becomes inefficient. If it is stored incorrectly inside, it affects airflow, increases humidity, and creates long-term issues inside the cabin. The solution was not more wood. The solution was smarter storage. She turned her attention away from the woodpile and toward the cabin itself. Frontier cabins are not perfect structures. They are practical. Gaps exist between logs, sometimes filled with whatever material is available: mud, moss, or compacted fibers. These gaps are usually treated as weaknesses, areas where cold air can enter and heat can escape. But those same weaknesses also represent unused space. Most people ignore that space because it is difficult to access and not designed for storage. She did not ignore it, she evaluated it. The walls were thicker than they appeared from the outside. Between the inner surface and the outer logs, there was a narrow cavity, not large enough to walk into, but large enough to hold material if used correctly. That space was protected from direct exposure, meaning it would remain drier than outside storage. It was also part of the structure, meaning anything placed there would contribute to insulation instead of interfering with the living area. The idea formed quickly, but the execution required precision. If she damaged the wall too much, she would weaken the structure. If she sealed it incorrectly afterward, she would create airflow problems that could make the cabin colder instead of warmer. She began carefully, not breaking the wall, but opening it in controlled sections, removing only what was necessary to access the cavity behind it. Each piece she removed was kept intact, placed aside in a way that allowed her to rebuild the surface later without gaps. This was not rushed work. Even under time pressure, she maintained control. That is the difference between preparation and panic. Panic destroys structure, preparation builds within it. Once the cavity was exposed, she started transferring wood. Not in bulk, not randomly, but piece by piece. Each log was placed deliberately, aligned in a way that maximized space while still allowing minimal airflow. Completely packing the space would trap moisture. Leaving controlled gaps would allow the wood to stay dry over time. This balance was critical. It was not just about fitting as much wood as possible. It was about keeping that wood usable when it was needed most. Time moved faster than she expected. The sun rose higher, but the temperature did not increase the way it normally would. That was another sign. The air remained sharp, almost metallic, carrying a stillness that usually came before a major shift in weather. She continued working, maintaining a steady rhythm. Carry wood, place it, adjust spacing, move again. There was no wasted motion. Every action was part of a system she was building in real time. By midday, the first section of the wall was complete. The difference inside the cabin was already noticeable. The interior felt more contained, less exposed to the outside air. The added mass within the wall acted as a barrier, slowing the transfer of cold. This was not full insulation, but it was enough to make a measurable difference. She did not stop to observe it for long. There was no time for that. One section was not enough. She moved to the next section and repeated the process. Open carefully, store efficiently, preserve structure. The physical strain began to build. Carrying wood repeatedly drains energy quickly, especially when combined with precise work that requires focus. Her movements slowed slightly, but not inefficiently. She adjusted her pace instead of forcing speed. That decision prevented exhaustion from taking over too early. In survival preparation, managing energy is just as important as managing resources. As the afternoon progressed, the light began to shift. Shadows grew longer and the temperature dropped further. The window for preparation was closing. She could feel it, not just in the air but in the way her body responded. The cold was no longer distant. It was arriving. That created pressure, but she did not allow it to disrupt her process. Rushing at that stage would create mistakes, and mistakes inside the wall would be difficult to fix once sealed. By late afternoon, most of the usable wall space had been filled. Not completely, but efficiently, enough to significantly increase both storage and insulation. The remaining wood was placed near the stove in smaller quantities for immediate use. That was important. The wood inside the wall was long-term supply. The wood near the stove was short-term access. Mixing the two would reduce efficiency. As the sun began to disappear, the temperature dropped sharply. This time it was immediate, the kind of drop that does not gradually increase but shifts within minutes. The air became heavier, colder, and still. This was the moment she had been preparing for. There would be no more adjustments after this. Whatever she had done during the day would determine how well she survived the coming weeks. She stepped outside one last time, scanning the land not for resources, but for confirmation. The signs were all there. The ground was hardening, the wind had slowed, the silence had deepened, winter had begun. She went back inside and sealed the wall sections carefully, restoring the interior surface so the structure remained stable and protected. From the outside, nothing had changed. The cabin looked the same as it had the day before, but inside, it had been transformed. It was no longer just shelter. It was a controlled system designed to retain heat, protect resources, and reduce exposure. That night, the test began. The temperature dropped beyond what a normal fire could easily handle. Cold pressed against the structure, trying to pull heat out faster than it could be replaced. But the walls held differently now. The added mass slowed the transfer. The interior temperature remained more stable, and most importantly, she did not need to step outside for wood. Everything she needed was within reach, protected, dry, and ready. That was the difference. Not more resources, not more strength. Better decisions made before it was too late. By the next morning, the temperature had dropped to a level where the environment no longer felt familiar. The kind of cold that doesn't just touch the surface, but settles into everything: wood, air, breath. Even inside the cabin, the difference was immediate. The fire had burned through part of the night, but without constant feeding, the warmth would have disappeared quickly. That is how winter works at this level. It doesn't allow pause. It demands continuous input. She woke before full light, not because she was rested, but because stopping for too long meant losing control of the only system keeping her alive. The first thing she did was check the fire, not casually, but with attention. The remaining coals told her how much heat had been lost overnight and how quickly she needed to rebuild it. She added wood carefully, not overloading it, not wasting fuel. Fire is not about making the biggest flame. It is about maintaining a steady burn that lasts. Outside, the world had changed completely. The ground was now solid, frozen deep enough that each step would echo through it. The air carried no movement. Even sound felt limited, as if the cold itself was absorbing it. This kind of stillness is deceptive. It feels calm, but it signals that the environment has entered a state where nothing recovers easily. Any mistake now would remain a mistake for a long time. She didn't stay outside long. Exposure at that temperature drains energy faster than physical work. She returned inside and sealed the door tightly, minimizing the exchange between inside and outside air. The real test began in the hours that followed. Maintaining heat in extreme cold is not a simple process. It requires constant balance. Too little fire and the temperature drops quickly. Too much fire and fuel is wasted faster than it can be replaced. She managed it carefully, feeding the fire in controlled intervals, allowing the cabin to build and hold warmth instead of losing it between bursts. This is where the change she made the day before began to show its full effect. The walls were no longer thin barriers against the cold. They had become storage and insulation at the same time. The wood inside them slowed heat loss and reduced the impact of outside temperature shifts. The cabin held warmth longer, giving her time between each adjustment instead of forcing constant action. But heat was only one part of the problem. The body itself reacts differently in that level of cold. Movement becomes slower, not just from fatigue, but from the environment resisting it. Hands stiffen, breathing changes, even simple tasks require more effort. She understood this and adjusted her behavior accordingly. She avoided unnecessary movement, keeping her actions limited to what mattered. Every step inside the cabin had a purpose. Every task was timed. This kind of efficiency is not instinctive. It is learned, often through experience or observation. Wasting energy in that environment is as dangerous as running out of food. Food itself became another controlled resource. She did not eat to feel full. She ate to maintain function. Small portions, spaced out, enough to keep her body working without burning through supplies too quickly. Digestion requires energy, and overeating in a survival situation can actually reduce efficiency. These are the kinds of decisions that seem minor but create long-term impact. Survival is rarely decided by one large action. It is shaped by consistent small decisions that either maintain stability or slowly break it down. As the day continued, the outside temperature dropped even further. The cabin responded differently now. Instead of feeling like a space constantly losing heat, it began to stabilize. Not warm, not comfortable, but controlled. That difference is everything. Comfort is not the goal in that situation. Stability is. A stable environment allows the body to recover slightly, to maintain clarity, to continue making decisions. Without stability, the body and mind both begin to degrade. She checked the walls occasionally, not by opening them, but by observing their effect. The air inside remained less sharp, less aggressive. That meant the system was working. The wood stored inside was doing more than just waiting to be used. It was actively reducing heat loss. This is what most people fail to understand. Resources are not just for later use. When placed correctly, they become part of the system that keeps you alive before you even use them. Night came again, faster than expected. Winter shortens days in a way that affects both time and perception. It feels like there is never enough light to do everything that needs to be done. But she had already completed the most important part. Now it was about maintaining what she had built. The fire continued, steady, controlled. The cabin held its structure. The walls did their job. But something else began to appear that night, fatigue at a deeper level. Not just physical tiredness, but the kind that affects thinking. Maintaining control for long periods without rest begins to wear down focus. Small details become harder to track. Timing becomes less precise. This is where many survival situations begin to fail, not from lack of resources, but from reduced attention. She recognized that and adjusted again. Instead of pushing through exhaustion, she created small periods of rest, allowing her body to recover just enough to continue functioning. Not full sleep, but controlled rest. Over the next days, the system she built proved its value repeatedly. Each time the temperature dropped further, the difference inside the cabin remained noticeable. Each time she needed wood, she did not step outside into dangerous conditions. She accessed it from within, reducing exposure and preserving energy. These advantages accumulated over time. What looked like a small decision, storing wood inside the walls, became the reason she could maintain control when conditions worsened. But survival is not static. The environment continues to apply pressure, and systems must continue to adapt. After several days, new challenges began to appear. Moisture from breathing, from melting snow, from the fire itself started to affect the interior air. Without proper management, that moisture could freeze against surfaces, creating new problems. She addressed it by controlling airflow carefully, allowing minimal ventilation at specific times instead of constant exposure. This prevented buildup without losing too much heat. Everything she did followed the same principle: control, not reaction; planning, not guessing. The frontier does not reward effort alone. It rewards understanding. Understanding how heat moves, how moisture behaves, how the body responds under stress. These are not things you figure out in the moment. They are things you apply when the moment arrives. Outside, the land remained frozen and silent. No movement, no change, just the steady presence of winter holding everything in place. Inside, her cabin functioned as a controlled environment within that larger system. Not perfect, not comfortable, but stable enough to survive. And that stability came from one decision made at the right time. Not gathering more, not working harder, thinking differently when it mattered. Because in the frontier, survival is not about doing more than the environment. It's about doing what the environment doesn't expect. As the days continued, the difference between surviving and slowly failing became more subtle. At the beginning, everything feels immediate: cold, hunger, pressure. But after a few days, the danger changes form. It becomes quieter, less obvious, and more dependent on small details. The body adjusts slightly to the cold, but it never truly adapts. It only learns to function within limits. And those limits can be crossed without warning if attention drops even for a short time. Inside the cabin, the system she built had begun to stabilize into a routine. The fire no longer required constant correction. The walls retained heat more efficiently than before. The wood stored inside remained dry, ready, and accessible. On the surface, it looked like she had solved the problem. But survival does not end when conditions become stable. That is often when new risks appear, risks that come from overconfidence or reduced vigilance. Her daily pattern became structured. Wake before full light, check the fire, adjust it carefully, then manage food and movement. Nothing was random. Even rest followed a pattern, taken in short intervals to prevent deep fatigue while maintaining awareness of the environment. This structure was not just about efficiency, it was about protecting her thinking. Without routine, the mind begins to drift, and in isolation, that drift leads to poor decisions. The cold outside remained constant, but inside, another issue had started to develop slowly: moisture. It is one of the most underestimated problems in winter survival. Each breath releases small amounts of water into the air. Melting snow adds more. Even the fire itself contributes to it. Over time, if not managed, that moisture settles on surfaces and freezes, creating a layer that reduces insulation and increases cold transfer. Left unchecked, it can turn a controlled space back into an unstable one. She noticed it early. A thin layer forming along parts of the wall. Not thick, not dangerous yet, but enough to signal a problem. This is where many people make a mistake. They ignore early signs because they do not seem urgent. She did the opposite. She adjusted immediately. Instead of keeping the cabin sealed at all times, she began introducing controlled ventilation. Not enough to lose heat significantly, but enough to release built-up moisture at specific times during the day. Timing was critical. Venting at the wrong moment could drop the temperature too quickly. Done correctly, it maintained balance. This is the level where survival becomes less visible and more technical. It is not about large actions anymore. It is about managing systems, heat, air, energy, resources, all interacting at once, and every adjustment has consequences. Her physical condition remained stable but not strong. No one becomes stronger in that environment. You maintain what you have or you lose it. That is the only direction. She conserved movement, avoided unnecessary strain, and kept her energy focused on maintaining the system rather than expanding it. This decision prevented gradual decline, which is one of the most common causes of failure in long-term survival situations. Time passed differently now. Without external markers, days begin to blend together. Light comes and goes, but the routine remains the same. That repetition can affect the mind in ways that are difficult to detect. Thoughts slow down, focus narrows, awareness becomes selective. This is another silent risk. When the mind becomes too comfortable in a pattern, it stops noticing small changes. And in the wilderness, small changes often signal larger problems. She avoided that by maintaining observation. Even within routine, she paid attention to details: the way the fire burned, the feel of the air inside the cabin, the condition of the wood she used. These checks were not dramatic, but they kept her connected to the reality of the environment instead of drifting into automatic behavior. The walls continued to perform their function. The wood stored inside remained dry, protected from the external cold. Each time she removed a piece to use, the structure adjusted slightly, but not enough to reduce its effectiveness. That was part of the design. It was not just storage. It was a system that could change gradually without failing. One point, the temperature outside dropped even further, a level where most unprepared structures begin to fail. Heat loss increases sharply, and maintaining internal warmth becomes significantly harder. Inside the cabin, the difference was clear again. The walls slowed the effect, giving her time to respond instead of forcing immediate reaction. This time advantage is critical. In survival, time is often more valuable than resources. It allows decisions to be made correctly instead of urgently. She adjusted the fire slightly, increasing output just enough to maintain balance without burning through fuel too quickly. This is where experience or careful thinking shows its value. Overcompensating would waste wood. Undercompensating would allow the cold to build. The correct response sits between those extremes. Days continued like this, each one reinforcing the same principle. Survival was not being decided by strength or endurance. It was being decided by consistency, by maintaining control when nothing seemed to change, by addressing small problems before they became large ones. Eventually, the outside conditions stabilized at their lowest point. The cold stopped dropping further and remained constant. This is another phase of winter. Once it reaches its peak, it holds. That does not make it easier, but it makes it predictable. And predictability is something you can work with. Inside the cabin, the system continued to hold. The wood supply remained sufficient because it was used efficiently. The air remained balanced because moisture was controlled. The structure remained stable because no part of it was pushed beyond its limit. At that stage, survival becomes less about reacting to danger and more about sustaining what has already been achieved. And that is where many people fail, not at the beginning, but in the middle, when nothing dramatic is happening and attention begins to fade. She did not let that happen. She maintained the same level of control from the first day to the last. No shortcuts, no assumptions, no moments where she allowed the system to run without oversight. And that is why she made it through. Not because she had more resources, not because she was stronger, but because she understood something that most people don't realize until it's too late. The frontier does not test how much you can do in a moment. It tests how long you can keep doing the right thing without stopping. By the time the fourth phase of winter settled in, the environment had reached a level where even small disruptions could become serious threats. Up to this point, her system had been holding steady. The fire remained controlled, the walls retained heat, and her routine kept everything balanced. But survival is not a fixed state. It is something that has to be maintained continuously, and when conditions intensify, even a stable system can begin to show weakness. That morning began differently. The cold was sharper than before, not just outside, but pressing harder against the structure itself. When she checked the fire, she noticed something immediately. The coals had not held as long as they should have. That meant heat loss during the night had increased, not drastically, but enough to matter. She added wood carefully, but this time the fire responded slower. The flame did not build as quickly, and the warmth spread more gradually across the cabin. This was the first sign that the balance was shifting. She didn't panic. Panic leads to overcorrection, and overcorrection wastes resources. Instead, she observed, the air inside felt slightly heavier, and there was a faint change in how the smoke moved. Not visible smoke filling the space, but a subtle difference in airflow. This is something most people would ignore, but in a sealed environment, airflow determines everything: heat distribution, oxygen levels, and how efficiently the fire burns. She moved closer to the stove and adjusted the airflow slightly, opening it just enough to allow a stronger pull. The fire responded, but not fully. That confirmed the problem was not just the fire itself. Something else was affecting the system. Then she noticed it. The cold outside had intensified to a point where the difference between inside and outside temperature was creating pressure on the cabin. Air was being pulled differently through small gaps, changing the natural flow inside the space. Combined with the controlled ventilation she had been using to manage moisture, the system had shifted just enough to affect how the fire behaved. This was dangerous, not because the fire would go out immediately, but because an inefficient fire consumes more wood while producing less heat. Over time, that leads to faster depletion of resources and a drop in internal temperature. She adjusted again, this time more carefully. Instead of increasing airflow further, she reduced unnecessary openings, sealing parts of the cabin more tightly. Then she allowed the fire to stabilize slowly rather than forcing it. This required patience. Forcing a fire in that condition can lead to smoke buildup, which creates another problem entirely. For a moment, she paused, watching the flame instead of reacting to it. The way it moved, the way it responded to small changes, these were indicators. Slowly, the burn improved, not perfect, but stable enough to continue. But the situation was not over. As the day progressed, the cold continued to press harder. The walls, even with the stored wood, began to lose heat slightly faster than before. Not enough to cause immediate danger, but enough to require more frequent fire adjustments. That meant increased wood usage. This was the breaking point she had prepared for without fully knowing it. Her system was still working, but now it demanded more attention, more precision, less margin for error. She changed her routine immediately. Instead of maintaining the fire at longer intervals, she shifted to shorter, controlled adjustments. Smaller amounts of wood added more frequently. This kept the burn consistent and prevented sudden drops in temperature that would require larger corrections. At the same time, she monitored the walls indirectly. The wood inside them was still dry, still effective, but now it was also part of a system under pressure. Removing too much too quickly could reduce insulation. Leaving it untouched while using only external wood could lead to uneven usage. Balance had to be maintained. As evening approached, another issue appeared. The air inside the cabin felt slightly thinner. Not dramatically, not enough to cause immediate alarm, but noticeable. This is one of the most dangerous changes in a closed environment. When airflow is adjusted too tightly to preserve heat, oxygen levels can drop while carbon buildup increases. The signs are subtle at first: slower thinking, slight fatigue, reduced reaction time. She recognized it early. This was the risk of sealing the cabin too effectively. She responded immediately, but carefully. Opening the cabin too much would allow heat to escape rapidly, undoing hours of effort. Not opening it enough would allow the problem to worsen. She created a controlled exchange. A small opening, positioned to allow air movement without creating a direct path for cold to flood in. Timing was critical. She allowed the exchange for a short period, then sealed it again once balance was restored. This was the kind of decision that determines survival in extreme conditions. Not dramatic actions, but precise adjustments based on observation. Night came again, but this time it felt different. The cabin was no longer in a stable state. It was in a managed state. Every part of the system required attention. The fire, the air, the walls, all connected, all affecting each other. She stayed alert longer than before, delaying rest, until she was certain the system could hold through the night. Even then, her rest was lighter, interrupted by checks, adjustments, small corrections that prevented larger problems from forming. At some point during the night, the temperature outside reached its lowest level yet. Inside, the cabin held, but just barely. The fire needed more frequent feeding. The walls slowed the cold, but could not stop it completely. The air required occasional adjustment to maintain balance. This was no longer preparation. This was survival at its limit. And this is where most people fail, not because they lack resources, but because the system becomes too complex to manage under stress. But she had built her system before the pressure began. And now, even at its breaking point, it was still holding. Not easily, not comfortably, but enough to keep her alive. By the time the next phase began, the system she had built was no longer just under pressure, it was being pushed close to failure. Up to this point, every adjustment she made had kept things balanced. Not perfect, but controlled. But survival at this level does not remain steady. It shifts, often suddenly, and when it does, even small mistakes can have immediate consequences. The mistake did not come from panic. It came from fatigue. After days of controlled movement, limited rest, and constant attention, her body had begun to wear down in a way that could not be fully corrected with short pauses. Her routine was still in place, but the precision within it had started to weaken slightly, not enough to notice immediately, but enough to create a gap. That morning, when she adjusted the fire, she added slightly more wood than necessary. Under normal conditions, that would not matter. A larger fire simply produces more heat, but in a tightly controlled environment, especially one already under pressure, excess heat changes airflow. It alters how oxygen moves through the space and how smoke is drawn upward. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The fire grew stronger. The cabin warmed slightly faster than usual. For a brief moment, it even felt like an advantage, like she had gained extra control. But then the change began. The flame started burning unevenly, not unstable, but different. The airflow was no longer balanced. The increased heat created a stronger upward pull, but because the cabin had been sealed tightly to preserve warmth, the incoming air could not match the outgoing flow. This imbalance caused the fire to consume oxygen faster than it was being replaced. The first sign was subtle. The air inside became heavier again, but this time quicker than before. Her breathing felt slightly different, not difficult, but noticeable. At the same time, the warmth began to feel less effective, even though the fire was larger. This is one of the most dangerous moments in a closed survival space, because it feels like things are working while they are actually becoming unstable. She realized it just before it became critical. Instead of reacting immediately, she paused for a fraction of a moment, forcing herself to assess instead of panic. That pause mattered. Without it, the instinct would be to open everything at once, flooding the cabin with cold air and destroying the heat balance completely. She acted in sequence. First, she reduced the fire slightly, not extinguishing it, but lowering its intensity to slow oxygen consumption. Then she adjusted the airflow, small opening, controlled position, allowing fresh air to enter without creating a direct rush of cold. For a few moments, nothing changed. This is where many people make their second mistake. They assume the first adjustment didn't work and overcorrect again. She didn't. She waited. Slowly, the air stabilized. The fire returned to a more consistent burn. The pressure inside the cabin equalized. But the damage had already come close. Her body reacted after the fact. A delayed wave of fatigue hit, heavier than before, not just physical but mental, the kind that makes it harder to focus, harder to maintain the level of control required for survival. This was the real danger of the mistake, not the fire itself, but the effect it had on her ability to continue managing the system. She recognized that immediately. Instead of pushing forward, she adjusted her entire approach for the rest of the day. Smaller movements, longer observation periods, fewer changes, but more deliberate ones. She shifted from active control to minimal interference, allowing the system to stabilize instead of constantly adjusting it. This decision prevented the situation from escalating further. But it also revealed something important. Her system, while effective, had very little margin for error. One mistake had nearly destabilized everything. That realization changed how she approached the next phase of survival. She became more conservative, less aggressive with the fire, more precise with airflow, more careful with energy use. Not because things were getting worse, but because she understood how close they had come to failing. As the day continued, the environment outside remained unchanged, cold, silent, unmoving. But inside, the situation had shifted slightly. The cabin was no longer just a controlled system. It was a system that required constant awareness of its limits. By evening, the fire had returned to a stable rhythm. The air remained balanced. The walls continued to perform their function. On the surface, everything looked similar to before. But internally, the difference was clear. She was no longer operating with confidence. She was operating with caution. That distinction matters. Confidence can lead to risk. Caution preserves control. Night came again, and this time her rest was even lighter. Not because of fear, but because she understood that her system could not tolerate another mistake like the one she had made. Each check of the fire, each adjustment of airflow was done with more attention than before. The cold outside remained at its lowest point, pressing constantly against the structure. Inside, the cabin held, but only because every part of it was being managed carefully. This was the stage where survival stops feeling like progress and starts feeling like maintenance. Not gaining ground, not improving, just holding position. And in the frontier, holding position is often the hardest part. By the time the final phase of winter began to ease, the environment did not suddenly become safe. That is one of the most misunderstood parts of survival. The end of extreme conditions does not arrive clearly. It shifts slowly, almost unnoticed at first, and if a person relaxes too early, the same environment that tested them can still take everything away in a moment. She understood that, so even when the pressure began to feel slightly less intense, she did not change her behavior. The first sign was not warmth. It was variation. For days, the cold had remained constant, unchanging, pressing against the cabin with the same intensity. But now, there were small differences. The air outside no longer felt completely still. There were slight movements again, barely noticeable, but enough to indicate change. The temperature still dropped heavily at night, but during the day, it held for slightly longer before falling again. These were not signs of safety, they were signs of transition. Inside the cabin, her system continued exactly as before. The fire was controlled, not increased. The airflow remained balanced, not opened fully. The walls still held their function, even though the pressure against them had begun to reduce. She did not remove wood from them unnecessarily. She did not reorganize anything for comfort. Everything remained as it had been during the hardest phase. That decision is what carried her through the final stretch. Because transition periods are where most mistakes happen. After days of strict control, the mind begins to seek relief. It looks for opportunities to relax, to reduce effort, to assume that the worst has passed. But the environment does not follow that same logic. It changes on its own terms, not based on what someone feels. She maintained discipline. Her routines stayed the same. Wake early, check the fire, adjust carefully, monitor the air, control movement, manage resources. Even when it felt like she could do less, she chose not to. That consistency protected her from making the one mistake that could still undo everything: premature change. Over time, the signs became clearer. The outside temperature began to fluctuate instead of remaining fixed. The light during the day lasted slightly longer. The air, while still cold, lost some of its sharpness. These changes did not happen all at once. They built gradually, but she observed them without reacting to them immediately. Eventually, the moment came when the system no longer required the same level of intensity. Not because she had changed it, but because the environment had. The fire held longer without adjustment. The air remained stable with less controlled ventilation. The walls still retained heat, but the difference between inside and outside was no longer as extreme. Only then did she begin to adjust. Slowly, carefully, she reduced the frequency of fire feeding slightly, allowing the system to adapt without sudden change. She increased airflow in small increments, preventing moisture buildup while avoiding unnecessary heat loss. She began using wood from outside again in limited amounts, testing the conditions instead of assuming they were safe. Every adjustment was gradual. Nothing was immediate. That is how she transitioned out of survival mode without risking collapse. Days later, the environment had shifted enough that the cabin was no longer under constant threat. The cold remained, but it no longer dominated every decision. Movement outside became possible again, though still limited. The land, which had been completely still, began to show signs of life returning in small ways. Only then did she allow herself to step outside for longer periods. Not to gather immediately, not to rebuild, but to observe. The ground, still frozen, had begun to change texture. The air carried different sounds, subtle but real. These were the signals that the most dangerous phase had passed. She had made it through, not by overpowering the environment, not by taking risks, but by maintaining control from beginning to end. Looking at the cabin from the outside, nothing appeared extraordinary. It was the same structure, the same placement, the same rough construction. No one passing by would see what had happened inside. No one would see the system built within the walls, the adjustments made day after day, the decisions that kept everything balanced when it could have failed. But that is how survival often works. It is not visible. It is not dramatic. It is built on small decisions made at the right time and maintained consistently. Most people imagine survival as a moment, a single action, a single event that determines the outcome. But in reality, survival is a process. It is the ability to keep making the right decision again and again, even when nothing seems to change, even when fatigue builds, even when the environment applies constant pressure. She did not win against the winter. She endured it. And that difference is what kept her alive. Because the frontier does not reward strength alone. It rewards understanding. Understanding when to act, when to wait, when to change, and most importantly, when not to. That is what carried her through. And that is why, when the winter finally released its hold, she was still there, inside a cabin that had become more than shelter, more than protection. It had become the reason she survived.